Hello, and welcome to Agents of Nonprofit. My name is Alexander Lapa, and I'm here to speak with everyday superheroes helping nonprofits. Joining me today is Kenita Smith to talk about grants. Kenita, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me. Hi, everybody.
So, as we get started, I'm curious if you could share with our audience your superhero origin story.
Oh, wow. So, my superhero origin story is really quite not superhero-ish. I started out basically in healthcare, corporate world, and I decided that I wanted to do something that I love to do or find my passion. I didn't know what it was. But I am a giver. I've always been a giver all my life. Giving shoes off my feet before is just something that I just have to do, right? And I thought, well, why not give for a career and figure out something that you can do in the nonprofit world? Now, I had no nonprofit experience, no donors, no grants. This is just completely out of left field. But I thought, let's help single parents. And because I was a single parent going through college and I did not have help with childcare and rent and things like that. In fact, I was told because I was attending a 4-year college that the government wouldn't help me with childcare, that they would help me if I was receiving a diploma or a certificate, which I thought was completely backwards because I'm getting a 4-year degree. But they wouldn't help me at the time. And so I thought, single parents need help with these things while they're in school to keep them from having to drop out. And what really would help is ongoing assistance, not just the one-time financial assistance, not just the parenting classes and the training on finances, but actual help because they don't have enough funds to make ends meet without the credential. So I thought of this program and I thought, hey, why don't we do $400 a month in rental or childcare assistance? And people thought I was crazy. No one's going to give you $400 a month to take care of an adult, But I gave it to a doctor friend of mine. I wrote up a little program, gave it to him, and he said, you have to start this program and I'll give you the seed money to get the 501c3 approval. And that is where the superhero started. And that's how I started helping people. So, not very superhero ish, but a good story.
I think it's a great story. And I love how it started from a willingness and a desire to give.
Mhm.
I keep on hearing that in order to search for happiness, a lot of people think that it's about receiving. It's about buying themselves something, whether it's an object or an experience. But studies have shown time and time again that actually, when we give something to someone else, that gives us a much stronger, much greater sense of happiness. So I'm happy you discovered that and you actually doubled down on that to be able to make a more of a career on it. So that's awesome. I think it is a superhero story for sure.
Thank you. Thank you. I love it. I mean, I love to give. I used to think I was crazy because I would give so much. But now it's like, hey, it's a part of my life and I love it.
Awesome. And then more recently, how have you started working? How did you change that to more of the grant perspective on things?
So it's a funny story. When I started out, I was under the impression, like most founders, when you start a nonprofit, you get grant money, right? As soon as you get that 501c3 certificate, I'm going to get $1 million grant.
Hmm.
That's what we think. And it's completely false. It is a myth, okay? Normally, when you start out, you don't get grant funding right away. They don't tell you this. People tell you, oh, you get your 501c3, you'll get grant funding. But there's really a timeline that foundations look at. And they normally don't fund you if you're under 3 years old because it's a risk. Most nonprofits don't make it past 3 years old. So they want to make sure that you're sustainable. But most of us just think when we get the 501c3 certificate, we can get a grant right away. And I thought the same thing. So I started sending out proposals that had no information in it, just what I wanted to do, no data, no stories. And I sent it for $1 million, $50,000, thinking because I had this great mission that they would fund me. And every single last proposal was denied, as you can imagine, because I had no experience in writing grants. And so I began to look for a grant writer. And when I looked for a grant writer, I had one grant writer that was happy to take my money, even though I was under 3 years old. And she got absolutely nothing approved for me. And then I came across another grant writer who sat me down and she said to me, Kenita, you're not going to receive a grant right now because you're not grant ready. She said, take my focus class and let me teach you how to become grant ready. And I'll also teach you how to write the proposals. And once I'm done, you'll get a grant. And when we were 2.5 years old, I got our first grant. So once I got the first grant, I started writing all of our grants. And we ended up getting a $50,000 grant, another $50,000 grant, and then we started to grow. And I said, from now on, I'm writing all of my grants. And then once I started writing grants, of course, people started hearing that I was writing grants and asked if I would help them write grants, which I absolutely refused because it's too time consuming for me. But I would tell them what they needed to do to get grant ready. And that's how I kind of got into the grant space because I had to learn on my own and by error that there are certain things that I had to do to get grant ready and certain ways that I had to articulate our mission to be able to be funded by foundations. And that's really how I got into the grant business.
You mentioned a timeline for grants that usually
Mhm.
it's a 3-year mark. So is there a point to even try to apply for your first grant before 3 years? Because you mentioned also 2.5 years you got one. So is there like
Yes.
a specific moment in time that nonprofits shouldn't even bother considering applying for a grant? And if so, how much is that? Or is it more a criteria based, or is it criteria based or time based, basically?
Well, it's twofold. So in most cases, there's a time base for most organizations. They'll look at your proposal, they'll ask you when were you founded, and when they see less than a year, more than likely they'll, automatically configure in their mind, I'm not going to fund this proposal, right? But if there are certain criteria that is met, then that may change their mind in terms of looking at your proposal. And so if you have things like a successful track record where you've shown that the program has actually been a asset in the community, has actual data behind it that you have supported and helped the a number of people, and you can show the results and the outcomes to your goals, and you can also show that the organization has been sustainable. You've been able to sustain it with fundraising and with donations before getting grants, then that is admirable to the foundations and also gives you a credibility. And then they begin to look more at your 990 or your financials. If you have a 990 or a 990 easy or postcard, and then they determine if you are at the point to which they would be interested in funding your mission and if you're accountable enough for that. So I believe that it's really twofold. It's really the time, but also the criteria. If you meet the criteria and you're less than 3 years, then you have the likelihood of being funded like I was at 2.5 years, but I had criteria met before the 3 years.
In the criteria, you didn't mention story.
Mhm.
How important is the story when writing a grant?
The story is very important. And actually, I put that in a proposal. A lot of times under the goal and outcome section where we talk about the results, when we give the data, I also like to put a little story and a little picture of the people we've helped so that it can humanize the proposal. I think that a lot of times when people write proposals, sometimes we can get into the data or into the need statement a lot and forget about the impact of the story. But the story does bring the proposal home. It's just about, it's really knowing when to put that in and where, because sometimes some proposals don't allow that opportunity. But they may have another section, especially the online proposals, but they may have a little section that says other. Anything else you would like to tell us? And that's where you drop it. You drop the story there and you reel them in with that heartstring, and it helps make your proposal stand out from the others.
So applying for your first grant, balance between time and criteria, but it
Mhm.
sounds like if you're under 2 years, it almost sounds like it doesn't really matter what their criteria is because it's going to be, unless it's something super spectacular, you probably want to wait for at least a minimum of 2 years before you can apply for the first.
Yeah, I would. I would agree with that, but I also would say unless you have a relationship too, because I have a
Ah,
client that I've helped and she just got her 501(c)(3) status, but she had a relationship with someone with the foundation that loved what she was doing. And because we had already done the work of building out her strategy plan, she was able to show that and get a $10,000 grant. Now, that's the exception to the rule, but there are cases when that happens when there's a relationship involved. So I don't want to sound like it's never possible, but it is rare.
okay. Yeah, thank you for that call out because there's always going to be exceptions to all
Mhm.
these comments. And then the criteria like you mentioned, so you want to make sure there's a track record, you've got the proper assets, you've got data to support it, you're supporting your community, you're sustainable from donors and from other fundraising, you've got the credibility, and you've got the story. Any other criteria that you would like to see in a grant application or recommend to
Yeah.
see in a grant application?
I definitely feel like whoever is applying for grants would need to have financial statements. A lot of times, nonprofit leaders, they don't think about the importance of this. But every foundation that you apply for a grant from will require some kind of financial statement, a profit and loss and balance sheet normally, or audited financial statements. And so you need to have this available, and they're not going to accept just the spreadsheet that you put together with the accounting income and the expense. They want to see your actual financial. So I would say invest in QuickBooks. And one of the first contractors that you should invest in when you're hiring contract positions is a bookkeeper. Like the very first thing, because you will need it. And especially if you are applying for a restricted grant, they would like to see a financial report at the end of the grant year or the grant time frame, and they want to see how it was spent. And so you want to be able to have that detail in a report and be able to provide that. So I would definitely say that financials are necessary. And just make sure that you have your board together. Sometimes people will start a nonprofit and they won't treat it as a business. They treat it as just their passion. Oh, I'm just doing this work, and they're not organized. But a nonprofit should be organized. You know, you have to have a board to run your nonprofit. You have a corporation. So make sure your board is together, that you have a number of persons, directors around your board that support you and that are willing to give back to the organization. We say 100% board giving should be a requirement. You don't have to tell them what amount, but everybody on your board should be contributing to the mission because they're board members. They're not just volunteers, right? So they should contribute and have that, because foundations ask for a list of your board and they ask what kind of skill set they have. So just make sure you have the right people around the table with you and your financials, in addition to the other things that I've mentioned, and you should be good to go.
Is there any value or importance on the tone as you're applying to this grant? Like I imagine, because my high school teacher was really, really strict. And so she instilled this very deep sense of, your grammar, your vocabulary has to be on point.
Mhm.
Your tone has to be very important. How much of those, I would call them maybe more soft elements, are important in terms of the grant? Or is it, as long as you write the data and you're more robotic, you should be fine. Is there a value to adopting a particular tone? And if so, which tone? Or is there a certain persona or a visualization you should go through? Like I'm pretending to write to a person, and here's how I would speak to them in that sense, like a friend, for example, or a colleague, or um, a senior. Like, is there any part of the phrasing of the grant application that's important?
Yes. So it really is dependent upon who you are writing the grant to, because certain grants require certain kind of vocabulary and certain textures, I like to call it, in terms of how you write and the level of your language that you write in. For example, if I'm writing a government grant, I do want to write with language that is easy to follow and comprehend, but I do want the grammar to be polished, right? I don't want it to sound like I'm just talking to a friend about our mission. But you do want it to be easily followed, because a lot of times, volunteers or people are reading those proposals and they may not know what big vocabulary words mean. So you do want it to be easily comprehensible, but it should be polished, right? But if I'm writing to a family foundation, then it should also have, of course, good grammar and things of that nature, but you could take a different tone and speak more on a friendly tone with them and become more humanized and not as robotic. They do want to know the data, though, and they do want to know the outcome. It's very important for them, but you can speak in a different way. And lastly, if you know this foundation, like if you've gotten grants from this foundation before and you've become familiar with the people, then you can certainly speak through the grant as if you're building that relationship with that individual. And of course, you still want to have good grammar and have proper sentences and things like that, but you can speak upon the relationship within the proposal too.
I like that. Textures. I
Mhm.
never used it in a verbal context, but it actually, I like it because it's a good visualization. Thank you for
Yeah.
that. So it sounds like aside from like there's a foundation, you need to make sure that grammar is there, data is there,
Mhm.
vocabulary. But vocabulary and tone changes based on who you're applying for. And that actually makes a lot of sense because you're right. A family foundation would probably prefer a different tone than a government agency or someone you said you're really familiar with. So the tone and the grammar can change a little bit as long as it's always accurate. And of course, the data has to stay the same. Would that be a good summary of what you just said?
Very good summary. Great
Cool.
summary.
Okay, so let's say then you apply for that. We'll stick with that first grant principle for a second or thought. And then you mentioned earlier about restricted grants. So there are sometimes when you apply for the grant and you get it, because we're going to jump ahead, there are certain conditions that are bundled with that grant, right? Restricted
Yeah.
is one of them. What other restrictions or conditions are normally tied to a grant, be it reporting or certain feedback? And what can a nonprofit expect to have to provide back to the grant funder?
Well, your proposal is like your word. Your word is your bond, right? So whatever you put in that proposal, the grantor expects you to meet that. And if you have a problem meeting that, then they expect you to communicate, right? So if you ask for general operating funds, then they expect you to be able to use the funds for anything general operating, but they still would like for you to report on the outcomes of that funding, even though it's not restricted. So you want to make sure that you still have stories to tell. You still have good data to show about the impact that you've made for the year, possibly using some of the statistics from your annual report into that grant report so that they can know and report on what you've done. If it's a restricted grant that you've got approved, then you do a little bit more. You definitely want to make sure that you're using the funding for exactly what you told the funder that you would use it for. If you said I'm using it for program operations to buy book bags for 20 kids, then they should be able to see 20 kids on your financial report and that book bag purchase, not that you spent it on cafeteria food because that's not what you asked for. So you want to make sure you use the money for what you asked for and then you report on that. If there was any hiccup, if there was any challenges you had, then you definitely want to share that because they want to hear the good, the bad, the ugly. They want to hear the truth. And so sometimes the truth isn't pretty. We tried to do this, but we couldn't find kids. So then we had to go over here. And, they want to hear the stories of that. So you provide the financial detail report and then you provide a little write up. So you want to have the accountability and the tracking mechanism or the management of that grant readily available when you apply. So, just expect to have that report ready to write within a year of getting that grant or whatever time frame they tell you in your approval letter. But you would definitely need to hold yourself accountable for the funds and be expected to do so. If for whatever reason they find that you have not used the funding for what you requested, they can request it back. And who wants to do that? Who wants to give money back? And the likelihood that they'll fund you again will be very slim if that happens. So Just hold yourself accountable to the funding. Make sure that you actually use it for what you asked for. Don't make up a program for the funding. I tell people this all the time. Some people will make up a program just to be able to get the grant fund, and they don't have the program. Then they get the grant fund and they're trying to figure out what to do with the money because you don't have that program. Don't do that. Don't chase the money and create programs for the money. Go after what's available for the programs that you have, and then hold yourself accountable, manage that money, and you won't have these kind of problems.
It sounds like you're just basically building trust, right? You want to
Building trust.
you
Absolutely.
you have to be transparent, you have to be honest with what you're doing and what you're using it for. But
Mhm.
I also like the fact that you're sharing the truth even if it's bad news. That's
Yeah.
something you don't hear very often because people do want to have a glossy and rainbow unicorn type of approach to things.
Mhm.
They don't necessarily like sharing bad news. And you're saying go for it. Like,
Go for
show
it.
that you've made an effort, you've done your best, didn't quite reach it, but here are your contingency plans or your backup plans to be able to get there. Because I find in general too that usually sharing bad news can connect people even faster than good news. Because when everything's
Yes.
good, it's easy, it's simple, it's straightforward. It's actually all the good stuff that makes people. I find, for example, and it's anecdotal, but when a friend of mine tells me stories, it's usually the stories that are really like bizarre and weird, great adventures that go wrong that make the best stories. And
Hmm.
I find that him sharing those kinds of stories is very powerful. And I feel more connected than saying, yeah, everything was great. Nothing really happened and everything was just easy peasy. So there is some psychology behind that.
Yes. And I feel like too, it just makes it more real.
Mm.
If every time everyone always has a great experience, I mean, it's just not realistic. If I'm a 3-year-old organization and everything is going easy peasy, okay, really? Like, nothing is going 100% well in a 3-year-old organization. Nothing's going 100% well in a 20-year-old organization. Like something is a challenge. And the founders want to know what that is. And a lot of times they may ask you about challenges because they may be looking at different ways to fund you. So if you're like, oh, everything's great, I don't have any challenges, I'm the president of the year, it's not real. And they're looking for realistic representation in the community and a real relationship with you that is based on trust and honesty.
Going back to the restricted versus unrestricted grants, is
Mhm.
there a general percentage of distribution between them? Like just, even if it's not quite accurate, but just an idea, like do you find in general grants, most of them tend to be restricted, unrestricted? Is there a balance between the two? I'm just in the world today, for example.
Well, really, since COVID, I mean, in time before, you probably found a little bit more general operating grant funding out there. But now, after COVID, things have gotten a little bit more restricted. During COVID, of course, foundations just wanted to support organizations that helped with COVID. And so they got a little bit more restricted in the funding. And now, a lot of times, organizations and foundations want to support program more so than general operating. But there is still a lot of general operating funding out there because the smart foundations know that organizations can't run without general operating funds. Everything can't be restricted. Right. And so they know that and they provide an avenue for that. So I'm not one of those grant writers that will tell you that there's no general operating funding out there. I don't believe that that's true. I've actually had a lot of general operating funding, but there are a lot of program restricted funding opportunities out there as well. And sometimes that does seem to be more so than a general operating since COVID.
Just because I'm a techie, I'm curious, would you put tech under the program, under general operations, or something else?
Depending, depending on what it is. And the reason why I say that is because, for example, I could invest in technology that helps bring in applications from my website into my program database. That is actually a program software upgrade, and I can put that under program software admin. Okay. But if it's just something that's general, like I just want to have some kind of AI software that will help me with grant writing or something like that, then I could put that under general operations or general admin or even fundraising if I wanted to. But it really just depends on how you're using the tech as far as to where you put it.
You've kind of alluded to this before in terms of restricted. The idea is that when it's restricted, of course, you want to use the grant money for what it's intended for. If it's not quite restricted, is there anything that a nonprofit shouldn't do with the money? Like you mentioned also earlier, don't don't apply for a grant when you don't actually have the program,
Mhm.
and then come up with a program afterward. But is there any other general rules to say now you got this sum of money, let's figure out what to do with it? I mean, obviously, some people can mismanage money. So, are there any general guidelines you can offer to say here's definitely things you shouldn't do with any grant money?
Sure. I mean, going back to my first thing, definitely don't use it for what you didn't put in the proposal. No surprises when it comes to how you use money. But also, just in general, even if you do receive a general operating grant that's not very restricted, or even just a general program grant that doesn't list particular restrictions, but they do want it for general program use, you know that foundations really want to see outcome. So you certainly would not want to invest the money in an area that wouldn't produce the outcome for your programs. So, you don't want to invest it in, the next best Apple computer, for your whole entire organization. If that wasn't what was discussed, if it wasn't a tech support grant or a capacity or capital grant, then you want to kind of err on the side of caution and make sure that you're investing it where the organization can see the outcomes related to that, or can see that capacity has been helped, or that efficiency of a program has been helped, especially if this is your first time receiving a grant from them. If it's not been specified that you're doing things particularly for capital or for equipment and things like that, then you want to kind of make sure that it's going towards an outcome in a program related goal. Especially looking at the foundation's priorities will help you with this too. Like even if they give you a general operating grant, but let's say they focus on youth services and that's one of their missions and core focuses for their funding, then you want to invest it in something that would interest them and keep them coming back. So I would definitely look at guidelines and the focus of the foundation for that, and just make sure that whatever you do use the money for, you can show how it benefits community.
And aligned with, I like that, aligned with the actual grant giver,
Hmm.
because if they're doing program X and you apply for program Y and they're very, very different programs,
Yeah.
they might be less inclined to do it again
Yeah.
next time. Okay, that makes sense. On the flip side, then, is there any tips or tricks or strategies or tactics that you can offer a nonprofit to be able to maximize the benefits of a grant? Like, is there a way to stretch the dollar further? Or you mentioned making sure you're focusing on outcomes. Is there any other tactics that you can share with that would be similar vein?
Sure. So one of the things when I first got started and I got our first grant, I leveraged that money. Because I didn't have other foundation support, I used that foundation and asked for matching support to match that grant that I received. And a lot of times, foundations will respond favorably to that because they're giving half of what you need, but seeing double the impact because you've already received funding, which speaks to your credibility and your ability to be trusted, right? So you can use that to leverage more funding. And it has worked for me. And I actually tripled revenue one year doing that, actually 2 years in a row when I started out, because I leveraged the funding and I asked for matching support. So whenever you have a grant, you can ask for someone or another foundation to match it. You can ask for a donor advisor to match it. And then you can help double the impact. And a lot of times that helps. Another thing that I would suggest is collaboration. Foundations love when nonprofits collaborate. And even though we're in the world of giving and you think that we would all be kumbaya and want to help each other, the nonprofit world is competitive, very competitive, especially if there is small funding dollars in a particular area or mission. And so we need to be able to come together. We can do more together. We can do better together. And foundations are starting to realize this. So they have collaboration grants. But if you happen to apply for a grant that will benefit you and a partner that you have a memorandum of understanding with, and I'm saying that to make sure that I enunciate on that, have an agreement, okay, before you do this. But if you have an MOU with a nonprofit and you are doing work together, maybe you can come together on a grant. And that will say to the foundation, hey, I'm impacting two organizations and two spheres of influence. And that's even better. And a lot of times they fund that too. So matching the grant that you get and then collaborating to have more of an impact.
Yeah, those are awesome tips. Thank you. Um, when when the nonprofit receives the grant, is there anything that they should do to market it in the sense of, you've kind of mentioned it a little bit here, but like, is there a benefit to, raising up those pom poms and cheerleading, say, look, we got this grant, whether it's your first or your 50th. But the idea is taking advantage of that moment to celebrate, not just internally, but externally to say, we got this, this is going to be awesome. And to market it in such a way to be able to hopefully get more grants in the future or more donations or more engagement or more something.
Yes. So yes and no. It depends. Let me say this. It depends on the foundation because some foundations don't want their grant acknowledged. They don't want you to post, they don't want to share their logo. And so you just have to kind of go with whatever their request is. But for those that don't mind it, they will tell you, yes, you can use our logo in this or that way. And yes, you can post and tag us. And so I would say for those, you make sure that you want to, well, you would make sure to post it on your social media pages and make sure you tag them and share a good story with it as to how they're going to help the community. That makes them look good in the community and that brings awareness to what they do as well and also helps them get funding if they are or a foundation that applies for funding as well. So that helps them. So you definitely want to share and acknowledge that if they're okay with it. If they're not, you'll be okay with not saying anything because you still have the check, so it's okay. But for those that do like the acknowledgement, make sure that you do acknowledge them and tag them so that they know it. It doesn't help if they don't know that you make the acknowledgement.
Even for foundations that want to be anonymous, can't you still share the positive news that a grant has been received anonymously for this much? Or would you
Yes,
think,
you can.
okay, okay.
You
So
can.
it's not just a matter of not advertising at all. It's just making sure that you keep that anonymous name.
Yes.
Okay. Following that, is there any other tips, strategies, tactics you can mention to, because you've mentioned three times a grant, three times the income for a particular nonprofit twice
Mhm.
in a row for 2 years in a row
Mhm.
now. Is there any particular propel the success of a grant to be able to obtain further grants in the future? Like once you've advertised it, you've announced it, you shared the good news when you can, and you've maximized your return on it, you've shown the outcomes. Is there any other tactics you can do to be able to put yourself in a better position as a nonprofit to obtain further grants?
Yes. So with my nonprofit, one of the things that is very unusual about our revenue when it comes to grants is that we've had similar or the same grants give for over 5 and 6 years every year in a row. And the reason why that happens for us is because I build relationships. For me, it's not a gimmick. That's just how I am. I'm a relationship builder and it's been working for me. But what I've learned is because I built that relationship with either the program manager or the admin that's responsible with reviewing our applications, that set us up for continuous funding. And when COVID hit and foundations weren't funding just everyone anymore, and they would say, we've stopped our grant cycle for right now because we wanted to see what we wanted to do. I got the call, hey, do you need funding? When they weren't funding people. And it was because I built a relationship with them off season. And when I say off season, I mean when I'm not asking for money, when I'm not submitting a proposal, I'm checking in and saying, hey, this is how life is going for me. This is what my toddler is doing right now. This is what my college student is doing. Let me send you a picture of my family. And we're building a relationship that's not based on when you give me money. It's based on doing life, right? And so as I'm doing life, they remember me when the emergency happens. Do you need any funding? And I'm like, yes, thank you. So build a relationship is the very key that I would say. Once you get in the door, don't let the door hit you behind you after you get the money. Keep the door open. Keep it cracked on the off seasons. Send them birthday cards. Find out information about the person you've been talking to. Send them congratulation e-cards and things when you find out that things have happened in their lives, or maybe they got some funding or funded a big project or something like that. Become invested, because if you invest in that relationship, that will show in your bottom line and your revenue, and that will keep them coming back to you. They'll remember you. And again, your proposal won't just be a piece of paper. It's actually connected to a personality and a person, and that changes things for you. So that helps you get more funding, and it also helps you get more frequently gifted awards from that organization.
I'm always curious about AI because it's a hot topic these days, and
Mhm.
I think it's cooled off a little bit. People were thinking it was going to be the next everything, and maybe that's still the case, but not at least at the moment.
Right.
And I'm curious to know, how has AI changed the grant landscape? I mean, imagine it's can help you with certain grammar and writing the grant, but is there any other elements that AI can help with aside from the assisting of the grant writing itself?
I think the greatest asset or benefit to having AI, in my opinion, is the amount of time that it eliminates. It really reduces your time when it comes to research. It reduces your time when it comes even to your writing. But I think that it doesn't eliminate your need still for the writer. Some nonprofits have decided, I'm going to just write a proposal through AI and tell AI I need a proposal on a particular mission and program. And you'll find that you will get good information and you'll get a format, but it won't be enough information to really make the proposal strong. And it won't have the elements that a person that has 30 plus years, say, of writing experience will have. Even though you can put a prompt that says you are a grant writer that has 30 years experience, but what comes out still needs a human element and a human touch to it and some revision, right? So it does reduce the time. I think it is helpful in what we do. It may help even bring some attention to ways that we can approach a proposal, because you can ask it for some strategies and ideas. And so I think that part of it is great, but it certainly doesn't eliminate your need for a writer. So just kind of keep that in mind, nonprofit leaders and development directors and coordinators, that you still will need someone who is knowledgeable about grant writing that can help tweak those proposals that AI gives you.
That's cute. I like the fact that you can't just prompt an AI to say, imagine you have 30 years experience and they have 30 years experience. It doesn't quite work that way.
Right, right.
Okay. And then also looking forward to the future, I'm curious to know if there's any other trends that you see coming or have your eye on. If you any predictions that you can make for the future of grant writing. Is it obviously COVID changed things as you mentioned, but I imagine there's it's an ever changing landscape to a certain extent.
Mhm.
So I'm curious to know if you have any predictions for the future.
I feel like we're trending when it comes to grant writing. It's not just, oh, we just write this good proposal and get funding. You're going to have to build relationships in the grant writing world now more than you had to before COVID. It's just a requirement. You're going to have to show and tell more than you did before. And I also think that it opened up the visual that you don't have to necessarily have a building to make impact. You don't have to necessarily always be working within an office to make an impact. It opened up that world to virtual. And so foundations, I believe, are becoming more lenient with virtual programs and virtual satellite offices and some of that programming and some of those foundations out there, where before it was a little harder for you to get funding for those things. So I think that those doors have opened and will continue to open. I also believe that we may see more funding opportunities in the cryptocurrency world. Some foundations may start giving grants in that way as we move more towards the digital currency, because we see more giving in that area too. And now, some of the millennials and different younger aged donors are giving in that way, and they're giving bigger dollars. So we're going to have to stretch our knowledge in the digital currency area. And I think foundations will have to come along with us.
Awesome. Kenita, this has been awesome. Thank you so much for all this information. How can people get in touch with you online?
You can reach me. I'm on Instagram at Starting My Nonprofit, and I'm also on Facebook at Starting My Nonprofit. You can also go to my website at startingmynonprofit.com, and you can request a free consultation if you are a new leader that is looking to grow your organization, or if you have your organization, you just need some more ideas, grant writing tips, or if you're looking to actually form your 501c3. I can help you with that too. And all of that can be found on my website at startingmynonprofit.com.
Awesome. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you. I had a good time. It was great.
All right, that's it for today. I'm Alexander Lapa, and I hope you join me again in the next Agents of Nonprofit.